Good afternoon. My name is Heidi Kokar. I'm the Executive Director of Rural Development Initiatives, and today we are having a community conversation about seeing diversity in rural and smashing small town stereotypes. For those of you who are unfamiliar with RDI, RDI is a 29-year-old nonprofit that has worked in the Pacific Northwest to supporting rural people, places, and economies. And we are thrilled to be with you today. If you want more information, you're welcome to visit our website and call any of us. We're always happy to connect with people in the Pacific Northwest and across the country related to rural. I want to give an absolute huge thanks to our sponsors, the Ford Family Foundation, Oregon Humanities, and Association of Washington Cities. But I also want to just suggest that any findings, conclusions, recommendations expressed in this session don't necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors and our funders. So just as that caveat. After the events of 2020 and the ongoing events from that critical year, RDI saw the need to organize a series of community conversations to elevate the discussion around some important topics that we saw cropping up. So far, we've hosted discussions through this series surrounding remote work, access to government officials and resources, and the rural-urban divide. Today, we are hoping to capitalize on the momentum and resurgence of the social justice movement to understand the true diversity of our rural places and consider what it will take to see rural diversity or see rural differently than simply white and homogeneous, to change the narrative about rural places and the people that are in them, and to understand what kind of support may be needed that will result in underrepresented groups being seen and included in their rural communities. Before we begin, I would like to ask us all to invite Grace into the room.
Grace, who's Grace?
Grace will look a lot like Curiosity as well. Please be aware that we are in a learning space as we start this conversation. We all would be best if we were willing to embrace some level of discomfort and to make and allow for mistakes. Be gracious with your listening and both brave and gracious when sharing your truth and your opinions. We appreciate your respect for one another and look forward to a very productive conversation. We are a large group meeting, so I also want to invite you to select the speaker view as your view so that you can focus on each of our speakers. Speaking of our speakers, I am joined by two wonderful colleagues and people who work in this field, Tiffany Monroe and Cassie Allen. And I will read you their bios. Miss Monroe is a 6th-generation farmer in Oregon. She received her bachelor's degree from Oregon State University in crop and soil science with a minor in horticulture. She later obtained her master's degree in community and leadership development with an emphasis in agricultural education from the University of Kentucky. Her graduate research on implicit bias focused on lowering racial anxiety, implicitness, prejudice, and racial colorblindness among entering freshmen. Additional research and programming, including evaluation of gardening and plant science curriculum for elementary school students, rural African American male perspective on education, and food systems, food justice, and race curriculum development. Postgraduate studies, Ms. Monroe has worked as the first African-American female agricultural and natural resources extension agent in Kentucky history, and for the Kentucky Department of Agriculture in the Office of Marketing and Product Promotion. She serves as the president for both the Lane County Farm Bureau and Lane Families for Farms and Forest Organizations. She was recently appointed as co-chair of Oregon Governor Kate Brown's Racial Justice Council, and she also serves on the board of directors for the Oregon Black Food Fund and Black Oregon Land Trust. That is an impressive resume, Tiffany, and I'm glad to have you join us. Cassie Allen is focused on assessing program and community building work for the Ford Family Foundation, improving practice, supporting innovation, and advancing strategy in support of rural Oregon communities. Prior to joining the Ford Family Foundation in 2017, Cassie was a tenured professor at the program director for the Master in Arts teaching program at Lewis and Clark College in Portland. Her background includes working as a senior researcher at Inverness Research in Portland. At Inverness, she led evaluation and research efforts for a range of equity-focused educational improvement initiatives, many based in rural communities. Cassie earned a PhD in education from Stanford University and a bachelor's degree in mathematics and its history, also from Stanford University. Thank you, Cassie and Tiffany, for joining us today. This is a fairly short session. It's a 1 hour to cover a huge topic, but we are interested in your questions and including your questions as we can. We have a series of questions that I will be asking, and our staff, Freya and Jennifer, will be working to uplift questions from the audience as best we can, but also note that we may not get to all of those questions, and hopefully we get to some. So I just want to mention that. So anything else, Freya or Jennifer, before we get started that you would like to add? No. All right. I will start with the first question we have. And Cassie, can you tell us how the heightened awareness of the social justice movement has impacted your work?
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. So great to see some familiar faces and a whole bunch of unfamiliar ones. I think these last couple of years, I think there's just a growing awareness across our state, especially across rural Oregon, that each of us has a role to play in our communities becoming more equitable and more inclusive places, and that social justice is not an urban challenge, it's a national challenge that manifests itself a little differently in different places. And that as we lean into this work together, we all are coming from different positions, different experiences, and how important it is to create space where we really can learn from and with each other. I think very specifically at Ford, following the murder of George Floyd, we began receiving many requests from our rural constituents asking us to expand our Select Books program. And they said, you all don't have any books on race in Select Books, and we need some books, we need some help. And so we responded by really doing a bit of a restructuring of the library and the categories, and added a whole series of books that I hope folks will check out that range from The New Jim Crow to Caste to the teens version of Stamped, that really help or are designed to help all of us sort of relearn some of the history that we may not have learned in school. And we think that that is mission critical when it comes to doing this work, especially in our rural communities.
Thank you. Thank you. Tiffany, I wonder if you, how this has affected your work. How has the heightened awareness of social justice movement impacted your work?
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to add that for my work is surrounded in agriculture, natural resources, and forestry, and promoting particularly folks in rural spaces that depend on that way of life. Being a person of color growing up in rural Oregon, and the disparities that I, along with my family members, faced always provided a lens for equity, diversity, and fighting for all people. And so those things have been able to be married together through my work and research. And now, particularly after last year, which we had mentioned in the introduction, it provides some validity and a voice to the work that I've done that I haven't had before. We were typically working in pockets and didn't really come to the forefront of philosophy and all types of work, whether it's economic development, in education. And now, when you look at the federal level, when you're looking at recent priorities that have been made, and including justice in the language, as well as follow through of the work and programs that are implemented at the federal and state level. We're now starting to see this come to surface, which is wonderful, because no matter what you're doing, you can have that lens of equity, who's included in this conversation, who's left out and why, and how can we bring them back in as a form of checks and balances, which is something that we love in this country as part of our foundation. And I would say other ways in the way it has affected is having I guess being able to question whether this movement and momentum is authentic and validated. And it's really important that as we continue this work to check the intention and what may result from activity related to social and environmental justice, and keep those infrastructures that are being developed, keep them sustained at the private level, at the public community level, as well as in government.
Right, so that it moves into the culture, the fabric of what weaves itself in. I also, thanks to both of you, I would say that mirrors RDI's experience as well, Cassie, with having a lot of interest in understanding more, and in services and efforts that help us deconstruct this, but also we as an organization, Tiffany, really being very aware that this is across all of our services. It's centering equity and this work in everything we do, not just as a separate work. So thank you. Tiffany, what tools are available as part of your work to understand and see the diversity of rural places?
Yes, well, I think I'm going to use the framework of Oregon. I know we have some folks from other states here, which I'm really happy about. But I wanted to bring up a historical context of Oregon, that we are the only all-white state in the entire country through exclusion laws. And, we are one of the most white states by design. And this isn't I'm not saying this to point a finger and say all white people are evil and be stuck in that spot. The point is to have history, living history and interpretation be a part of all that we do, and to remember, why communities are the way that they are, but also look back in history and know and find that brown and black people have always been here. Brown and black people were pioneers with some white settlers as well, or black and brown families came. Part of Oregon and Mexico, they are part of California, were a part of Mexico at one point. And we have this incredible history of indigenous and native cultures that have always been here, and unfortunately have been left out of the narrative. So as far as understanding and seeing the diversity, really promoting those historical and interpretive infrastructures that are in the state. In Eastern Oregon, there is Maxwell Heritage Interpretive Center, which is in Joseph, Oregon, which is a really small place, but this is an amazing program led by Gwen Trice, and she's telling the story of her family who were pioneers and loggers. So it's a great historical space that's also doing work in education today. There's Oregon Black Pioneers Organization. There's a large history of Asian Americans in Oregon, and really supporting and providing funding and resources for those spaces to educate. But then, there's the past, but then it's like, how do we bring that interpretation into the present? And so that's letting people who are of color in rural spaces have a voice and action, and then providing follow through. And I think that in the state of Oregon, Governor Brown's done a wonderful job of this. She has created infrastructures like the Racial Justice Council that have committees in areas like the one that I am co-chair of, the Environmental Equity Committee. We have education, criminal justice, and other areas where we bring in voices from all over the state who have expertise and experience in these spaces. And what's beautiful is this council, which was codified in the last legislative session, we help advise and provide recommendations to the governor and other departments and entities within state government. So that provides a point of leverage for folks to help with providing wonderful opportunities and infrastructure down into the community and uplifting those voices. And so there are other places where visibility can be provided, helping folks run for their local school boards and communities, helping them have leadership positions, helping them speak at county commissioner meetings when measures and subjects that are very critical to what a local community looks like, having that voice present. And additionally, hiring people of color, whether they're from those communities or bring in talent from other spaces, recruit and retain people in these rural spaces that are of color or have a strong foundation, or that lens that we were just talking about, Heidi, of putting equity first and foremost, no matter what. That is an amazing way to provide leverage, like we are out here. A lot of people say, oh, well, there's no Black people in rural spaces. But as we know, which I think later we'll bring up some data that's not true, but providing leadership opportunities. And once folks are in those seats, checking on them, how are you doing? Do you feel like your voice is heard? What can I do to help leverage you? Identifying allies that will have their back in those spaces, and being honest and saying, you know what, this is going to be hard. You are probably going to run into racism, but I am here to have your back. And you come to me and we'll get through this together.
Thank you, Tiffany. Cassie, I think you'll get into some of that data here as we ask you what tools are available as part of your particular work to understand and see the diversity of rural places. You are part of a energy and effort, or leading an energy and effort at Ford Family Foundation that really helps us see that. So explain that to us a little bit.
Sure. So beginning in 2018, the foundation started producing an indicator report called Oregon by the Numbers. And I don't know how many folks have seen it. We're getting ready to produce the 4th edition here in a couple weeks. And the goal of that report really was aimed at this particular question is, how can we put a tool in people's hands so that all Oregonians begin to see all of Oregon, and that we try to resist falling into some of these stereotypes. And I so appreciated, Tiffany, what your words just now, but I think we do get hung up on perceptions of places. And I think having trusted data helps us see some of the reality of places. And so, we have many communities across Oregon that are approaching 50% people of color, right? And our school system, 1 in 4 children in Oregon is a child of color. Everywhere we go in Oregon, we are on land that was not ours. And so I think, engaging and recognizing that history, looking at the data rather than our feelings or our perceptions of history, just really helps us have grounded conversations where we're all learning together. And I feel like in that space where you can make mistakes, learn from each other's experience, that's how we all get smarter. And so, I mentioned select books in the other question. I think it is also a resource for folks where they can gain some experience and exposure at their own pace. Select a book that speaks to them. But the Oregon by the Numbers work, if you haven't seen it, it consists of 36 county profiles for the state of Oregon, followed by a series of measure summaries for all of the measures there. And all of the measures are ranked by county with breakouts for urban and rural. And I think it can provide a really surprising picture of, we have certain perceptions of what our urban communities look like, what our rural communities look like. And that report can do a little bit of myth busting. And so I think anytime that we can engage in that sort of activity, I believe it helps us.
Was there, first of all, I want to appreciate one of the things that you said of that, that all of these counties, right, are on native lands and on original native lands. And I I do want to mention that this meeting is, I saw a participant, and this meeting is happening on Native lands, no matter where you are, and just recognizing that I personally am sitting on Kalapuya lands and thoughtful about which lands that you are living on and working in or born in, and tools. There are many tools for you to discover that as well. I want to be sure that we are aware and maybe take a moment to acknowledge the land that you are on and that this is here. Cassie, have been some myths busted, right? Like in some of the things that when you came up with, is there anything that just shines as like, I can't believe that the numbers showed me this? So, and a kind of a follow-up question to what you brought forward. And you mentioned some other numbers, they're worth repeating because I think you went by very, very quickly and didn't catch some of those because they're fascinating, I think, what you're finding related to the diversity of Oregon, as Tiffany mentioned, a state that is primarily white, really by original design. So.
Well, I mean, I guess there are a couple of things if you happen to find yourself looking at the report. And we do a race and ethnicity breakout in the report where we highlight every county for which the racial or ethnic breakout for that group is greater than the Oregon average. And, I think that folks will be surprised that, there are 10 counties in Oregon that get highlighted. For example, our growing Hispanic and Latino population, and all but one of those we would consider a rural county. And similarly with our multiracial folks, we have more counties that have a higher population of multiracial residents than we do urban ones. And so I just think there's a lot of surprises in the report. There's also a lot about income and what it costs to live in Oregon that I think is part of the social justice conversation in Oregon that I would hope that people also think about. So, one of the most expensive counties to live in Oregon is a rural county. And so as we're having this social justice conversation, I do think that there are issues of sort of access and income that accompany the conversations around racial justice that we may or may not get into today, but that I would encourage our viewers to go after as part of their own learning.
Wonderful. Where, Cassie or Tiffany, either of you, where do you think resources and energy should be directed to increase awareness of rural diversity and kind of shift our perception of rural and the makeup of rural?
I can go ahead and start. We previously talked about sort of institutionalizing equity and diversity and justice to come at the forefront of all work. And I think continuing to implement those standards within state and county governments is super critical, as well as within school systems and making sure people follow through on the current infrastructure that's already there. I really think that a good resource for all of you would be to check out the state of Oregon's DEI action plan that was recently released that helps with state agencies and how to implement those things. But I also think as far as individual energies that we can do is promoting, especially now that we've heard a little bit of data, is promoting those nonprofits and community organizations that are doing this type of work, who are daring and courageous enough to gather and say, we are Black and Brown, or we promote Black and Brown health and health of communities as a whole. Because when you help when you help anyone, you're helping the whole community, and supporting them on this webinar, I guess I'll call it. We have Lanisha Duke, who is the founder of Brown, which is Black, maybe I'll get that
Rural
back.
Network.
And Rural Network, yes, which I just joined, but it's amazing. She has been in a rural community, a county here in Oregon, and doing that work to basically say just what we're doing, like Black people are in rural Oregon, and let's, you know, provide opportunity to speak and be heard and seen and talk about what resources are needed within the state. I'm also a part of the Oregon Black Land Trust, Oregon Black Food Fund, and there are a lot of other amazing Asian American as well as Indigenous and tribal as well as Latino, Latina, Latinx community resources out there. And I think because Oregon has been preventing Brown and Black people from organizing together historically, there are more nonprofits and small community groups in our state than a lot of others that have a more widely known history. And I think it's because we're doing that to survive, but I think as an individual effort is supporting organizations like that and having, you know, the RDI help communicate the importance of those types of organizations and helping them have a voice in chambers of commerce and to association groups and helping them get to the Capitol to speak about issues would be wonderful.
Thank you. Cassie, do you have an answer to that question? Where do you think resources and energy should be directed to increase awareness?
I mean, I would just like to make a plug for investing in community building. I really believe that for this work to have an impact across rural spaces, we need to bring people together and support conversations that focus on belonging, on inviting people in, and investing in this sort of shared learning rather than othering and calling people out. And so I think that, I mean, this is an area that our foundation invests quite a bit in, and Lanisha is connected to our community building work. But I do believe that in order for the kind of change that we want to see to happen, it's going to be person by person and community by community. And we're going to be changing hearts and minds. I think, you know, one of the complicating factors is that people who grow up outside of Oregon often learn about Oregon history in a way that those who are raised in Oregon did not. And with our state growing at the rate that it has, it has created some uncomfortable circumstances, I think, when you have these conversations and somebody who, you know, grew up in California or grew up in New Mexico knows about a whole chapter of Oregon history that some people in the room never learned about in school. And I'm referring to the exclusion clause. And so I think that being sensitive to where we are, and there's that expression, you know, building bigger tables instead of taller fences. I think that there's a lot to be said for investing in community if we really want to change Oregon.
Right. Thank you, Cassie. Have you seen differences? I think this is something that this is maybe the biggest question that I'm in right now in my own work as a leader of a rural-based organization. Have you seen differences in urban and rural communities related to the social justice, how we address it, how we address it, how we see it, how we work with it? And I wonder what makes rural different from your perspective. And again, I'll leave it open for whoever goes first on this one.
I can start, Tiffany, if you want, and either way. I mean, I will just build on my response from the last question. I think one of the things that we have seen is different is that the language needs to be different. So we live in a state that suffers from a significant amount of structural urbanism. So because we have a very concentrated rural population, policies in Oregon are set to serve that urban majority. And under those circumstances, what can happen is that as soon as you start landing language that sounds like it is coming from an urban center, it is going to land differently in a rural setting in a state that has those conditions. So we really need to work on fostering the language of the community, local language. So that's one way where I think doing this work in rural is very different than doing it in urban. I think the other is that our education levels in our rural communities are not the same as our education levels in our urban communities. And so what that means is that there may have been less exposure and experience with places other than that rural community. People may have not, there's lower percentages of college attendance and so on. And that can just create some circumstances where folks can, if we're not careful and having the conversation, can very quickly, feel ignorant or dumb. And that shuts the conversation down immediately. And so I think we need to be extra specially vigilant in using language that doesn't trigger this sort of urbanizing feeling in folks and cause them to disconnect and sort of peace out of the conversation. And we need to not assume that folks have had, everyone's had the same experience, that they've gone to college, that they, had a roommate who was a person of color. And so I think that's our reality. And so if we're serious about doing the work, and this is not saying that anyone's any better or less than anyone else, that's what the data tells us, it's the facts. And so if we can lean into that reality as opposed to pretending it doesn't exist, I think we're gonna have a better shot at this.
Yeah, I found similar things. Tiffany.
Yes, I thought you did a beautiful job of explaining those differences. And as a person of color, even in rural space, I often even find frustration in the language that's used in different spaces. So I appreciate that in many different ways. But I have to say that when adjusting that language, it can be very exhausting for people of color or people who fight for equity, whether it's social, economic, or for people of color, to change the language in a way that almost seems like you're minimizing what you're fighting for. However, we do have to meet people where they are. And a lot of language used is language that provides a sense of threat or anxiety to a lot of people. And like you had said, not everyone has the same experiences, not everyone has the same education levels. And so even though it can be tough and exhausting, it's so important that we meet people where they're at, because there's a safety issue involved in this. If we come into a rural community and talk about racism and using those words, even though that's exactly what it is often, just using words that trigger emotions, there's a response and a stigma that gets thrown back at all the people of color who are working in and living in those rural spaces. And, part of the work that we did with the Racial Justice Council was passing Senate Bill 289, which was safety in the outdoors for people of color, which is extremely critical, because I think that's maybe a talk for another webinar, but we have to really be careful about the safety of folks when we are engaging and educating around social justice issues.
I'm going to have a moment. Thank you so much, Tiffany. And also, I think, for bringing your own voice into the room and your own experience into the room. I assume that is something I have seen from my part of this conversation. I think many people of color who are in this room can relate to. I also want to just take a pause now and just remember that we were inviting grace and learning, and I have seen such a beautiful demonstration of that. So I am not calling anyone out on it. As a matter of fact, I'm doing exactly the opposite and just saying what a wonderful conversation so far this is. This is a very difficult conversation to have sometimes, and I think it's a very important one. So I appreciate all of you in the audience who are asking curious questions and thoughtful responses, and even responding to each other's questions and taking care of the audience yourselves. And I want to thank you, but also to our brilliant panelists who are staying in their own vulnerability and curiosity and that space. So just an appreciation moment. I have a couple of questions from the audience. And I see some of them, I'm watching them get answered in other ways. So I'm tempted right now to move forward a little bit because I think that there's a couple of these that might show up in future answers. We'll get back to some of these questions. I see quite a few of them that haven't quite been answered. So thank you, Freya and Jennifer, for bringing those forward. I'm going to move forward to a couple of other questions of how do you think the new census data, the new census information that's coming out, Cassie, maybe you could start with this, can be helpful to increase awareness of diversity in rural?
Thanks, Heidi. I think that whenever we do a decennial census, it is a window into our reality. And I think because of the efforts that took place here in Oregon with We Count Oregon, we got a much better census response in 2020 actually than we did in 2010. And so I think that data is going to be invaluable for us in terms of seeing the realities across our 36 counties. I think that, one complicating factor or important factor to remember is that that data also makes clear just how quickly Oregon has grown over the last 10 years. And so I think the data is both going to expose our increasing diversity, make clear our increasing diversity, and shine a light on how important it is that we engage in these conversations that keep us rising together with a better shared narrative of our rural spaces as we move forward.
Thank you. Tiffany, do you have a response to that question? How do you think the census data can be helpful to increase awareness and diversity that's different than Cassie's?
I would just like to add, I think it's so important to share this data throughout the state, particularly, at the actually back up, not just at the county starting there, but in our school districts, showing like there are students that come from diverse backgrounds, are racial and ethnically diverse, and we need to invest in resources at the school level, share this data with county commissioners, with state legislators, and particularly with state departmental programs, and use that to be able to move resources, particularly with all the infrastructure dollars that have been rolling into a lot of states over the last couple of months. So using it as a tool to be able to shift and divide resources where needed is very important.
Thank you. This is a huge question, and I'm gonna ask it anyways. But and really, I'm looking for the answer. So if when y'all have it, please somebody write it down and tell me. How do we change the narrative to help people understand that rural Oregon is not homogeneous? I hear it all the time. I see it in my Facebook posts. I hear people talk about it from the outside. How do we change that narrative? And maybe to the people in the audience, right? We have 110 people in this call. I don't mean how do we, some mystery group of humans, how do these 110 people do this? How do we, the actual we that are here, do this? Is maybe the more interesting question than I have.
I'm happy to start and share a story that happened to us at the foundation and see if there are others. So, I mean, we need to get curious. We need to all see this as our work all the time, every day. And especially for white Oregonians, like this is our responsibility. And I think that when you get curious, you start to learn things. And so I don't know how many of you are familiar with a woman, Letitia Carson. I'm going to drop a link into the chat. But our headquarters is in Douglas County, which has a reputation, I think, of being very conservative, not particularly welcoming to people of color historically. And it was so exciting for me to be able to share with our staff the story of Letitia Carson, who was a Black woman landowner here in Douglas County, a fairly famous midwife. And when we got to share this story with our staff, people were just blown away, and it made them more curious. And so I think that we can't let up. So when we think about how we change the narrative, we all need to have stories to tell. We need to share those stories and keep looking for them, because as Tiffany said when she opened, I mean, there were Black people, brown people have been here for centuries, and our indigenous population, thousands, tens of thousands of years. And so it is incumbent upon all of us to tell the different, change the narrative individually so that it becomes a shared collective change narrative.
Thank you.
I love that you shared that story. There's actually a project happening right now at Oregon State University, and I encourage everyone in other states to have your universities or community colleges engage in interpretive and historical projects. I serve as the project coordinator for the Letitia Carson Legacy Project. So we're partnering with the NAACP, Oregon Black Pioneers, and Oregon Black Land Trust to work on reclaiming the space that she owned prior to moving to Douglas County. She actually moved, she was in Benton County, and her husband, well, we assume he is the husband, died. So her land got taken away. So, and it's now owned by Oregon State University as the bee farm. So we're trying to work on using this as a reclamation as well as reparations program to create opportunities for students of color at Oregon State, as well as living history and a place to teach people how to farm and be a part of the land, and using those stories and like the Maxwell Center that I talked about in Joseph, or Oregon Black Land Trust, and also sharing the story of the Calpullia people who were there in the first place before she was there. So we're also working on first foods and getting in contact with some of the tribes. But that's part of the messy story of the West, right? I think there's a lot of people who are here from Washington, Oregon, Colorado, California, or wherever space you're at, is our stories are complex and they're beautiful, even though there's a lot of hurt and pain within them. And it's using those stories as opportunities to uplift people and not be afraid of saying what happened and what's happening today, as being associated through those powers and structures, and using it to do great things going forward.
Yeah, we, in the leadership program that RDI has put forth for the last, for decades now, we have a concept called appreciative inquiry, and the idea that wherever you have trouble, whatever's going wrong, and whatever's the biggest challenge that you have in any given place, in any given world, there is something going right from which to build. There is something that is already moving, something that is there to uplift and to help motivate you to the next step. And so, Cassie, I heard that in your story, right? Of like, how do we find what's going right instead of focusing on all that's going wrong? Because this is a very complex, complicated problem, and it's easy to get dismayed by that. So appreciative inquiry is something I will put forth as a tool that I have used and find so helpful in so many of the complex issues that our communities are grappling with as they reinvent themselves and revitalize their places. What infrastructure, social, built, or economic, is needed in rural places to improve the quality of life for marginalized populations? What infrastructure? And I really want us to think social infrastructure, economic infrastructure, built or natural infrastructure. What does that look like in your minds?
Well, earlier I mentioned about providing opportunities for people of color in rural spaces to serve in leadership roles on different boards, commissions, and have influence and a voice that's not typically represented. But I really love that you just spoke about economic opportunities. And I think we really need to promote rural entrepreneurship that is specialized for people of color. I think helping folks, whether they're from the indigenous and tribal communities, to be able to take talents and resources and knowledge to create economic viable opportunities is wonderful, as well as our Latina, Latinx communities, helping them be able to create business and the literacy components that are associated with that, right? Whether you're wanting to go into the agriculture or forestry space or have a storefront, I mean, you have to pay taxes, there are forms you have to fill out, you need to have a good CPA, and there's marketing, and a lot of places, rural spaces, there's an internet issue. And so helping have those educational opportunities as well as infrastructure would be incredible, because when we look at rural communities, there are families that have been in power or influence roles for generations. I mean, part of my family has been that way. There's roads named after our last name, and I appreciate that. However, there are other people who haven't had a chance to do that as well. And so helping those families be established and be able to be leaders and influence communities and schools. I mean, it will change the way communities look in a positive way forever. So helping people of color be successful business folks would be just absolutely amazing. And I think RDI could be a part of that. For sure. Or you're already doing it, but I think continue to do the movement and partner with chambers and the community colleges and other entities in those spaces. I'm sure there's tons of work you're doing, but whatever we can do to help, that would be amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, the economic justice piece of that is included, right? You mentioned a couple of justice economic, that I will add economic justice on it just because I'm an economic development based organization. Cassie, what infrastructure, social built economic is needed in rural places to improve the quality of life for marginalized populations and communities?
I really want to put an exclamation point on the entrepreneurial ecosystem type work that Tiffany alluded to. I think promoting that in our rural communities is key. I think an entry point can be some inclusive community visioning work. So I think providing sort of an alternative structure that actually helps people build the leadership skills that would give them the confidence and capacity to then get on the school board, perhaps become part of a city council or something, but to have these community visioning efforts that allows rural residents that truly represent the community, ethnically, ancestrally, economically, and gender. That can be a thing for the women who are doing a lot of the work. But I think that if we can get these visioning groups going that are more profoundly inclusive, they can really begin to provide a new voice in the community, speaking together. And if in fact there needs to be some nudging of more traditional structures, they can become this sort of alternative form of infrastructure that can help with some of that work.
Thank you. We have in the background, there have been multiple questions that have come in related to organizations and what organizational leaders can do. And often in our communities, many of our communities, I would suspect the 106 people we have on here are in some position of leadership, some position of ability to make change. But they're asking questions like, do you have any advice or resources for nonprofits who would like to prepare their strategic plans, policies, bylaws, and begin a thoughtful recruitment, outreach, and engagement plan when there are board members that are reluctant or don't see the relevancy? There was other ones of how do we initiate this conversation on the topic, particularly if board members don't see the relevance. And then there's just multiple questions in here about kind of shifting the culture of your organization. And I know that I come from an organization whose culture has shifted in the last decade in amazing ways, but I'm thoughtful from the organizational point of view and resources for that. And I also encourage you on the chat, if you know of resources, this can be considered a peer learning event as well. So if you have answers to this question, then please feel free to put those into the chat and help us with this question, because it's a really great one as we as local organizational leaders are really leading for diversity, equity, inclusion in our places. So anyone have an idea related to organizational resources?
Go ahead, Cassie.
Good. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me and of the changes I've seen in our organization is just really investing in learning, and this idea that, again, I'm sorry for folks from other states, but I mean, Oregon is changing. The world is changing, and we may have had a skewed perspective of what it was like to begin with. And so I don't want to, beat the drum too much, but I think that they're engaging our leaders, and I would say in our case, our board, in just sharing the facts, having them see, that our scholarship recipients are over 50% people of color, and helping, working with Oregon by the numbers, and continuing to just have, it's a constant drumbeat, it's a constant conversation, and slowly, things just sort of start to shift, and it becomes normalized that you're having that conversation. It's not a one and done. It's just part of how we work. And so I would just, it's a little bit of the not letting up, but I think it's bringing data into the room, bringing stories into the room, investing in having the conversation, sometimes investing in a facilitator that can help with a conversation. There's some couple of consultants that we've used that have been particularly helpful. But knowing that this is long-term stay the course work. This is not something that changes in an instant or in a single meeting. It's about really committing to go the distance together.
Tiffany, do you have a response? I also have one, but I defer to you initially. Yeah, I will. I appreciate the many people who are putting resources and assessments into the chat. RDI originally did our own. We've been on, like I said, a journey for now since 2015, which I'm going to say it's always been our journey, but really doubled down and focused on it since 2015, and started with assessing ourselves and our own capacity and really figuring out where we are to work from that perspective. So we annually do an assessment related to our capacity for being what we will call a culturally responsive organization. There's multiple assessments that you can do. We have used historically the Coalition of Community of Colors assessment, though we had to shift it a little bit for ourselves. I know Meyer Memorial Trust has a spectrum tool that they have on their website if it's available. There's multiple of them in the chats. But my brain says start from understanding, even if from whatever you can, right? From if that's just staff, but initially our board led this work, now our staff leads this work, and we're trying to figure out how that can be. We're all leading this work, we're in that spot, but it has now been a 6-year journey, and I will say we've, on the spectrum of it, we're about right here, we're still working on it. So it is the long game. So it is exactly what Cassie said, of ensuring that it is always your conversation. It's always. Tiffany, did you want to add?
I would just say seek some of the data, or if the data isn't there, reach out to your governor, to your legislators, and say, hey, you need to invest in generating this data. However that needs to happen, we need to shift resources that way. And when having data or accessing what you can, project what will things look like if those investments aren't made, is something that folks need to see. If you don't invest in social justice, here are the big problems you're going to have down the road.
We are at our last question, and so we're 7 minutes from wrapping up. So I'll ask one last question. We don't have a ton of time for it, and it's of course a huge question. RDI works to bring communities together to understand diversity and shine light on common interests. What suggestions do each of you have to help rural communities increase their knowledge and become more inclusive? And maybe we've asked this question multiple times in multiple ways, but just to wrap it up. And I do want to mention that there is LGBTQ+ comments in the, so including that in this answer may be a helpful response. Question: what do you suggest to help rural communities increase their knowledge and become more inclusive?
Yeah, well, I think we've touched on a lot of amazing points here today. And the first one I want to touch on, because I think it's really important, is providing opportunities to increase safety for people of color or people of communities like the LGBTQ plus, and those that are socioeconomically suppressed. Shifting mindsets and moving work in another direction, as we mentioned, can be threatening to folks, and making sure that we protect everyone in the community and provide resources and making sure that people are heard and that they have a pathway for safety is extremely important. But I really think what we talked about is having, entrepreneurship opportunities for people in rural spaces is very important. I find my family being farmers and woodland managers, we have seen a lot of rural communities just be completely destroyed because of jobs not being available because of the political direction our state has gone in. And that leads to drugs coming into communities and a lot of really big challenges that are faced. So providing safety networks for folks to be able to have jobs and create new opportunities is very important. And of course, those that are of color or those vulnerable populations are the ones that are going to be hit first and the hardest. And I just think working with infrastructure that's already there, school boards, working with county commissioners, and continuing to bring this conversation forward is really important. And having those conversations like Cassie talked about, those community conversations where you can even just invite communities in and say, hey, we want to talk about what is needed here in this community, and truly following through on the ideas that have been identified. And if it falls outside of the wheelhouse of RDI, pulling in those other entities, whether that's cooperative extension in a rural community, and encouraging universities and land grants to bring in staff that either put equity first or maybe look like or have a similar background to the people who are represented in those communities is extremely important. But I think also having programs like this is amazing, and inviting, we have tons of people on the call today. And I think I saw one person, it was representative of a state. So there must be some legislators here, but continuing to host programs, continuing to give people a voice, and then follow through on the resources that can support them. And if they aren't there, let's all fight to make sure that they are there.
Thank you, Tiffany. Sorry, I was muted. Cassie, you want to try it?
Sure. I will never. Tiffany, you covered so much.
You just right, and the mic drops.
Perfect. I guess the one piece that I would add that I have found helpful, and Anne's iPad put a comment in the chat that was similar to what I was going to say, is that I think in my experience, there are a lot of white folks in Oregon who just their circles, their life has not overlapped with people of color, and they're nervous about it, and they don't know how to start. And I think to the extent that we can provide opportunities for folks to interact and get to know each other, we will encourage the kind of change narrative that we've been talking about today. And so, ways, if we can, it's hard with this crazy virus that we've all been dealing with now for more than a year, but I do think that if we invest in this kind of connectivity, relationship building, and people get to know their neighbors that they may not have ever even known lived in their community, if we try to get those circles to form more of Venn diagrams with some overlap, I just think that we reduce some of that otherizing, and our communities then become more inclusive places, and folks become more aware of subpopulations that are, right in their midst. I'm always surprised and overjoyed actually to hear people tell stories of like, oh my gosh, this thing is in my community. I've lived here for 20 years. I had no idea. Right. All because a new relationship has formed. And so, it may sound a little too good to be true or a little old fashioned, but I think people to people still works, and it especially works in rural. And so I would encourage us not to forget that.
Yep. I love watching people fall in love with their community in different ways all the time. You saw several different resources and links in the chat, and I want to thanks for all who put forth some of those links. We will try to pull the best of those for maybe a resource list as we send out. But I also want to thank the Ford Family Foundation for just a brilliant resource, which is a select books list, and the many different select books that they have available to all Oregon and Siskiyou County, California residents to learn more. I just deeply want to thank Cassie and Tiffany for being with me today and on this conversation, and bringing forth this conversation. Your grace, your curiosity, your braveness was inspiring. So thank you. And thank you to our funders for making this session possible. Also the Ford Family Foundation, of course, there's just such a great rural funder in our region. Oregon Humanities and Association of Washington Cities as well. So we are covering our Pacific Northwest. As Freya and Jennifer mentioned in the chat, we have these sessions recorded. We will send out that recording to all who are on this, and also some links that we have, but also that will be available for you to download, I believe, on our website. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks for having lunch with RDI and this really great conversation.